To vax or not to vax? That is the question. I'm actually not going to talk with you about my personal viewpoints of vaccination, but what I want to do is share with you some history from our great nation. Some history that you may not believe. I want to share this history with you because it's going to help you form a better opinion. It's going to help you form a better argument as you converse about these things with your neighbors, your family, your loved ones, as you form your opinions about what we as a republic stand for, what we stood for, and what we will stand for in the future, because you and I are the members of this republic. So right now, we're expecting to be told that all federal employees will be getting vaccinated if they want to keep their job. That's anybody that's in the employ of the federal government. And let's be honest, the federal government is the largest employer of people in the United States. Fact. From the military to all of the governmental positions, we the people employ thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So if they're all forced to take vaccines, that would be a huge win for those that want that. Again, this video is not pro or anti-vaccine, it is pro-thought, because I want to give you something to chew on. What would you say if I told you that in our history, not the world history, but in the history of the United States of America, that we surgically sterilized, meaning we perform surgery on human beings to stop them from having the ability to make babies by either cutting the fallopian tubes or stopping the male sperm from getting out to where the eggs are? What would you say if I told you we did that, we, the people, had laws that we did that to those that we deemed to be unfit mentally, sometimes unfit because of criminal tendencies or criminal activities, or we just thought they shouldn't procreate? Would you think that we did that? The answer is yes. I'm going to read you something. This is a case that I want you to look up. This is Buck versus Bell, B-U-C-K versus Bell, B-E-L-L. It's a decision of the United States Supreme Court, so it went all the way to the top, where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. ruled that a state statute permitting compulsory, and that's not meaning I want it, it means I'm doing it to you, compulsory sterilization of the unfit, including the intellectually disabled, for the protection and health of the state. It's saying it did not violate the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States. So literally, I'm going to read you a little bit about this. This case said that the government can surgically sterilize people that are mentally handicapped, physically handicapped, or otherwise a burden. This case is also cited as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions, but check this out. So this dude, Francis Galton, has this concept of eugenics. Read about it, eugenics. E-U-G-E-N-I-C-S. Eugenics literally is population control. And he had a statute drafted that states could adopt to allow them to control people's ability to procreate. Looking to determine if the new law would pass a legal challenge on September 10th, so 1924, it's about 100 years ago, right? Albert Sidney Pretty, the superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, that was the name of the, probably more like a prison, but it was a hospital, the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, he filed a petition to his board of directors to sterilize a young woman by the name of Carrie Buck. Buck is the one whose case name we got, right? She was an 18-year-old patient at the institution who claimed, according to him, that she had a mental age of 9. So Doc said she had an age of 9, the superintendent, she was 18. Pretty maintained that Buck represented a genetic threat to society. Doesn't this kind of sound like maybe what went on in Nazi Germany? This young girl who maybe was a little slow mentally was a genetic threat to society. They wanted to start to clean up our genes. According to him, Buck's 52-year-old mother possessed a mental age of 8 and a record of prostitution and immorality. So because she liked to have sex, they wanted to do the same thing to her. They wanted to sterilize daughter and mother. The mom had 3 children without good knowledge of their paternity. Buck, one of these children, had been adopted and attended school for 5 years, reaching the level of 6th grade. However, according to Pretty, that's the superintendent again, Buck eventually proved to be incorrigible. And she gave birth to an illegitimate child. So this young 18-year-old girl had a child of her own. Her adoptive family had her committed to the state as feeble-minded, feeling they were no longer capable of caring for her. It was later discovered that Buck's pregnancy was not caused by any immorality, because, having sex before you're married is immoral and you're going to go to hell. But rather, in 1923, while her adoptive mother was away on account of some illness, her adoptive mother's nephew raped her. And that is how she got pregnant. So, later the court goes on to rule 8-1 decision, 8-1, that Buck, her mother, and her infant daughter were all feeble-minded and promiscuous, and that it was in the state's interest, so not the state like the state of California or the state of Virginia, but the state being in the government's interest, to have her sterilized. The ruling legitimized Virginia's sterilization procedures until they were repealed in 1974. So we did this shit for almost 100 years. So later, a historian, Paul Lombardo, argued in 1985 that Buck was not feeble-minded at all, but that she had been put away to hide her rape perpetuated by the nephew of her adoptive mother. He also asserted that Buck's lawyer, Irving Whitehead, poorly argued the case, went on and on and on. This is horrible. Can you imagine a world where your government, my government, says, I can snip your testicles, chop your fallopian tubes? Well, guess what? Our government already did that. And they did that, I'm going to read you a little bit more, using a whole nother case. I'm going to read you something that Justice Wendell Holmes said when the case was heard by the Supreme Court. So the ruling was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in support of his argument that the interest of public welfare outweighed the interest of individuals in their bodily integrity. Let me read that again. The interest of public welfare outweighed the interest of individuals in their bodily integrity. This is the core of our American belief system, that we, you and I, you and me, have a right to our sovereignty. I'm not talking about some crazy bullshit. I'm talking about my right to me, to be free. This is 100 years ago they were saying this stuff. Justice goes on to say, we have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. So literally what the justice said, what Justice Holmes said, there he is, by the way, sweet mustache. Justice Holmes said, we draft people to go to war. So because we draft people and send them to their death, how can you, this is what he's telling the reader, how can you not understand that we can also tell people they have to get a vaccination or have some other medical procedure that the state demands? And then he cited Jacobson versus Massachusetts, Jacobs versus Massachusetts as a precedent. So that's a legal term. Precedent means that some other law body, some other judge, some other legal mind has looked at a case and weighed in on its constitutionality and said, this is constitutional and here's why. Now there's a precedence. So now you have to argue against that precedent, which is why it's so important that we pay attention to who gets elected to the Supreme Court. Holmes concluded by citing Jacobson versus Massachusetts as the precedent for the decision, stating 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Talking about grandma, daughter, granddaughter. The sole dissenter in the court, Justice Pierce Butler, a devout Catholic, did not write a dissenting opinion. Carrie Buck was operated upon, receiving a compulsory tubal litigation. She was later paroled from the institution as a domestic worker to a family in Bland, Virginia. She was an avid reader until her death in 1983. Her daughter, Vivian, had been pronounced feeble as well. That's heartbreaking. I mean, that boils my blood. An 18-year-old girl was probably sedated, put down on a table in some 100-year-old operating theater, they would have called it then, and had her ability to procreate stolen from her by our government, by our Supreme Court, by Supreme Court justices that were put there by men that we the people elected. Why am I telling you all of this? Because we argue, you and I, when I say argue, I don't mean I mean we try to bring somebody to our way of thinking. We discuss our viewpoints, our opinions. When we say argue, we're not talking about being loud and boisterous. We're talking about using facts, reason, logic, and trying to understand what the other person's saying or thinking, and in turn, help them understand what we are trying to say or think. When we are arguing about things like forced vaccinations by the state, and we say, look at what the country's coming to, look at where it was. At the same time this was going on, criminals were being sterilized, and not just sexual criminals that they said, hey, these guys are a threat to society. We don't ever want them to make more babies because those babies may grow up to be like dad. So let's just snip those nuts. Homosexuals, males in particular, up until the 1950s, were sterilized by the state in many places, including Great Britain. Check this out. This is an article from the Boston Globe written August 25th by Nicholas Tempino. Nice name. And I want to just read you a couple things out of it. There's a couple of good points that he's making. 1905, the Supreme Court ruled that Massachusetts could fine people for not taking a smallpox vaccine. The case established a precedent for a 1922 case, which was Zuck versus King, that allowed San Antonio to mandate vaccines for all public and private school students. More recently, the Supreme Court cited Jacobson's case in its decision about whether to permit governors in California and New York to place occupancy limits on religious services. So basically, this one case about vaccines from over 100 years ago, they are saying can be used to sterilize people, can be used to control and limit occupancy on church services, and more. So in 1902, a smallpox outbreak, which smallpox was freaking terrible. Make no mistake, I have no problem with vaccines for many things. I am vaccinated and will continue to receive vaccines throughout my life for various things. I'm glad that nobody I know, including my offspring, has polio, which was the scourge of the world for a long time. It was the scourge of one of our presidents. I'm glad I don't have smallpox and have to deal with some of these things. In 1902, a smallpox outbreak in Cambridge, Mass. led the Board of Health to require people to get vaccinated or pay a $5 fine. So they just said, basically, pay a tax if you don't want to do it, right? Pay a fine. Henning Jacobson was a Swedish-born pastor. He argued that compulsory vaccination is hostile to the rights of him as a free citizen. And he also went on to say that it was basically him being illegally forced into doing things that he didn't want to do. This goes against the very concepts of liberty. In the ruling on that case, Justice Marshall Harlan acknowledged that the court could intervene in cases where the state committed a palpable invasion of rights secured by the fundamental law, and that the state could carve out medical exemptions for those to be harmed, likely to be harmed by a vaccine. But the ruling established the principle that the state has the power and responsibility to protect the health of the broader public during an epidemic. Harlan drew an analogy between a draft dodger and a vaccine refuser, writing that a compulsory vaccination is a legitimate exercise of the state's police powers. An individual may be compelled by force, if need be, against his will, and without regard to his personal wishes or his pecuniary interests or even his religious or political convictions, to take his place in the ranks of the army of his country and risk the chance of being shot down in its defense. He just described somebody being drafted into military service. He said, hey, if we could do that, we could stick a needle in your arm and force you to get this vaccination. In the 1927 case of Buck versus Bell that we talked about, Holmes, the judge that cited the opinion, he said, it's the state's right to sterilize feeble-minded against their will and consent. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting fallopian tubes. He then went on to say 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, talking about mom, grandma, and daughter, the little baby. Why I'm looking at this history and sharing it with you guys is when we just start to scream about America's this or America's that or never or don't, and we have no formulated opinion, we can't really take that anywhere. You're just noise. It's just traffic. It's just barking dogs at night. The reason I think that history is important is it helps us understand, wait a second, we're not so special. By we, I mean we humans. I constantly put this in the comments section. We are safer now than we've ever been. We are more fit. We have more food. We have more fresh water. We have more things, all the electricity, the internet, all these amazing things. We have more access to knowledge. We have more access to liberty. Can you imagine the state saying that they were going to castrate you surgically because they felt like it? You would say no, you couldn't believe that, but we did it. We did it. That law in Virginia was on the books till 1974, and technically that law is still a ruling that's never been repealed by the Supreme Court. So that ruling, that Buck ruling that the Supreme Court did all those years ago is still never been repealed by the Supreme Court, meaning that unless somebody argued it correctly, and I'm sure in this day and age it wouldn't so much happen, we could chemically or surgically rather sterilize somebody. Full circle. We have to, you and I have to better articulate our viewpoints. I have many friends that are in the healthcare business, law enforcement business, work for federal government, are in the military, and many of them don't want to get a vaccine. I don't care what your opinion is on whether or not you think that the COVID vaccine is good or bad. I don't care. That's not what this is about. And it doesn't matter what I think about it. But I do think that a human being should have the right to choose what they put in their body. Always have, always will. I mean, hell, if we could tell a girl that she can kill a baby that's inside of her, can we not also tell a person that they don't need to inject a serum made by a farm lab into ourselves? I think that if we could make that stretch, if we can compare forced conscription into the army, the draft, if we can compare that to the cutting of fallopian tubes of somebody deemed to be an imbecile or a child in the case of one of them, can we not also make these other analogies? I think so. I think what's important is that we stand together, really. I think that we don't need to be violent. I think we don't need to be angry. Look, long and the short of it is millions of people can't go home from work, okay? There's not somebody to come take those jobs. Stand together. You do what Americans do best. You stand up. You do what you believe in. You do it peaceably. You do it with knowledge backing your play. You do it with conviction in your heart. And you understand that in the course of human events, as our founders wrote, in the course of the human events of our lives, of the lives of those that have come before us in this nation, we've made grave mistakes. So as we look at the mistakes that the fools in Washington may be making now, they've all been made before, maybe not the same. I don't quote scripture very often, but here's one that I think fits. The heart of man is desperately wicked. It is. I mean, people are compelled to do evil shit. Whether you want a vaccine or not, what I want from you is to be a better steward of the nation handed to us. And in that, a better proponent for what it can be, what it should be, by your actions, by your deeds, by how you live, not by what you just type on Facebook or on social media, but by what you do. That is how we change the world, man. That is how we propel us to a better, more perfect union. More perfect union, as Lincoln said. How can we? By trying, by listening, by not forgetting about who we are and what we've done. I don't mean you and I, but those that came before us. And you know what? We all. No needle's going in me unless I want it to. That's a fact. I can say that easily. Try it by force. It won't go well. I swear that. Try it by force. Try it to my family by force. It will not go well. And I know too many people that think that way. As such, I don't think that will happen. But if you try to tell hundreds of thousands of people that they must do this or they have no job, well, that might cause a problem in the way that the machines of government work. And you cannot replace those people overnight. In fact, the way people work these days, I don't think many of them will be replaced at all. Big picture thinking, guys. Demand more from yourself. Tell somebody you love them. Study our history. I believe in you. Be well.